Hey guys, the Instant Camera Guy here. Before I start this video, I want you to realize that yes, this topic is quite long. It's a very in-depth discussion, but I believe this is some of the most important information that you could ever become aware of if you're planning on ever owning or shooting with an SX-70 camera. It is absolutely crucial, and I recommend at the very least, if you want to get this information, just leave it on in the background and listen to it as if it was a podcast. I don't believe it's super necessary to visually pay attention to this video, but at least listen to the message. Hello everyone, the Instant Camera Guy here, and welcome to a video that I've been wanting to do for quite a while in some way, shape or form. If this is the first time that you're stumbling across the video because you follow my channel, then welcome back. Otherwise, it may be that I've linked you to this video in order to educate you. And what I really want to do is spend some time in this video just talking about the importance that is having an SX-70 fully refurbished if you're going to expect the best results from it. Now, here at the Instant Camera Guy, I offer all kinds of cool upgrades for clients' cameras. Everything from the SX-70R PCB with its dedicated Bluetooth dongle, through to my Overhaul battery mod, which adds 2 AAA-sized lithium batteries to run the camera so that you can shoot I-type film, through to reskinning and all kinds of stuff. On this particular 680, for example, I even added flash sync. So I'm capable of upgrading quite a lot of different cameras and really providing a service that can take them into the 21st century, whether it be through manual control PCBs, whether it's that I'm restoring it and keeping it original and just ensuring that it can, work for another 50 years, or whether I'm providing an I-type battery solution. And this has come at the cost of people wondering how much all of this costs. Now, typically, any kind of upgrade that I perform, whether it is a PCB upgrade, such as the new SX-70R PCBs that replace the original circuit board in the camera, or whether it simply be the battery upgrades that you see before you, there's one thing that all of my products have in common, and that's that I only install them on cameras that have been refurbished first. And the reason for that is a lot of these mods are quite involved, and it just doesn't make sense to do it to a camera that's not already refurbished. The analogy I use is it's like finding your grandfather's old 1968 Mustang in a barn. It hasn't run for the last 40 odd years, and you decide that you want to stick a brand new 800 horsepower crate engine into it because you want to take it down to the drags and impress your friends. Well, the truth of the matter is you can do that, but you're probably going to be better off refurbishing the rest of the car too. You're going to want to check the suspension, the tires, the transmission. You're going to want to upgrade the brakes if it's going to be traveling that fast. You're going to make sure that the chassis hasn't rusted out, and you're going to figure out if there's any other problems that have arisen as a result of storing the car in a barn for 40 years. And well, the SX-70 is a similar kind of deal. For me to install one of these PCBs is not quite as simple as just slapping it in to the back of the shutter housing, where the old one used to sit. On many models, I've got to adjust, modify, or at the very least, clean and calibrate the solenoid. I've got to take the anti-static or wax layer off the shutter blades. It's quite involved, and so it's not something that I can really do as an upgrade per se without making sure the rest of the camera works, because, well, if the shutter is going to work perfectly, I kind of need to make sure that the motor ejection system works perfectly too, and that the rollers are clean, and that the gear train isn't about to break, and lots of different things. And the same goes for the power system. My Overhaul system especially, which, in case you haven't seen the videos, I will try and link it in the description below and show you guys on the screen what those videos look like, but it is basically a solution where I add this little AAA lithium-ion battery holder to the back of the camera, which sends approximately 7.4 volts of electricity into this little buck converter chip, which then runs inside the camera in order to power it. it's the kind of thing where, although it looks like a stick-on mod, there's a lot of wiring involved, and it requires taking the base panel off the camera, stripping it down to something like this where it's just the chassis, and then wiring it in and bypassing the film counter and all that kind of stuff. It's quite involved. The thing is that although technically you only need to remove the base panel, if the rest of the camera hasn't been serviced, well, it's probably a good idea for me to then open the rest of the thing up, clean the Fresnel assembly, make sure that all the mirror system is good, reassemble it, make sure that the gear train doesn't have the little plastic coupler as it does in this particular example, and make sure that everything on the inside is as clean as the outside, especially if it is a Model 2 variant camera, such as the ivory and the black, which are notorious for having crumbly synthetic skin, which gets inside the camera. It's a good idea to then clean the mirror. I mean, you can see just how filthy this one is for some odd reason. And so it's one of those things where if I have the camera already opened up, it just makes sense to work on every single thing possible while I'm inside there. I mean, after all, I've already opened it up. It's not like I can easily get back in there in the future if something goes wrong. And the reason for that is the leather panels on these cameras hide the screws that you need to access to get inside them. So it just makes sense, while I've got everything off the camera, do everything at the same time. And that is why these days I don't charge per individual repair job. I generally have one flat fee, which I generally keep listed on my Facebook and Instagram pages. I generally try not to mention price in videos because these videos stay on the internet for a long period of time, and I don't want to suddenly find 5 years' time, inflation and the cost of things has risen and people are going, didn't you used to charge $90? It says so on your video. So I try not to mention too many prices in these videos. But I generally will charge a flat rate, and that flat rate is for an overhaul of the camera. So that's not me going, oh, the drive shaft coupler's come undone and the motor's running, I'll just fix that, put it back together. No, that is me stripping the camera down to the chassis, stripping the shutter housing down to the chassis, removing all the pieces that are critical, putting them back together again to ensure that every single function of the camera works, whether it be the shutter, the flash fire assembly, the film eject, making sure the motor's reconditioned. I have to do all that kind of stuff if I'm going to guarantee the best results for the end user. And so that's why I charge a flat rate. The only way that my price suddenly increases is if I need crucial parts, for example. Let's say the internal mirror assembly that goes up and down inside the camera is smashed or something. Well, I'm going to have to source that from another camera, so the price goes up. But 90% of the time, I don't need spare parts. I'm simply just reconditioning the camera while I'm inside, and that is why I charge a flat rate. Now, an interesting thing has started to happen since I've offered these upgrades, and especially since I've started this YouTube channel. I get more and more people contacting me asking me, hey, I have an SX-70 or a 680 or whatever it might be. I purchased it from XYZ company. They tell me it's fully refurbished, so I don't need to have the camera fully refurbished. Can you just add the dongle, add a power supply, add the new PCB? Can you just 600 convert it? Can you just reskin it? It depends on what the client wants. Now, prior to me making this video, my answer was, sure, send it my way. Provided that the work is up to my scratch, I'll happily do that job for you. But as of me releasing this video, I have decided to change that policy. And my policy is now that I will be fully overhauling your camera regardless of where it came from. There's a simple reason for that I'll talk about in just a second. But effectively, I'm swapping things around, where instead of assuming that things are going to be fine, I'm going to assume the absolute worst case scenario that your camera needs to be worked on from the ground up, and so a full overhaul fee will apply, which is subject to me discounting it if I find that yes, indeed, things were done pretty well in the first place. And, you know, it minimized the amount of work that I had to do. I was really just checking things and I was happy with the quality, and thus I'll be able to discount what that flat rate would be. But from now on, you can just assume that the overhaul price applies. Now, the reason for that is simple. I take great pride in my work, and I stand by every single camera that I've made and refurbished. And I really do mean that. Every single camera that I have personally worked on, I stand behind. Because I know that I've personally been inside each one, and I know that I've fully tested it to the best of my ability, and I know that it's going to work as good as it possibly can. And generally, if you're messaging me through social media, I'm going to send footage of it working before I send it out. I'm going to send you a whole bunch of test videos and photos of exactly what you're buying. And that's because I'm a one-man operation. If you message me, you are speaking to me. If you comment on my YouTube channel and you get a response, it's from me. If you reach out on social media, you're talking to me. If you send me a camera to refurbish, it's me that's personally doing the repair. So I have to take very high pride in my work and have a very high standard of work if I'm going to be successful, because I'm literally a one-man operation. So what that means is, regardless of where you buy your camera from, if you're sending me something that's already been refurbished, I have no way of knowing what's gone on inside the thing before it got to me. Now, that's not to throw shade on other repairers out there. There are other technicians out there that are on par with my skill level, just as good as me, capable of doing just as good a job. But the thing is, I didn't do the job. People make mistakes, and there's no standard of repair that exists. Now, that's something that I'm trying to change with this YouTube channel. I'm trying to show the world exactly what it takes to get one of these things working as good as humanly possible. And if you have a look at some of my videos where I do 2-hour-long deep dives into how to service these things, you'll see just how involved it needs to be. And the reason that I'm doing this is, over the last few weeks, I had a few clients send me refurbished cameras that just ended up with various issues. Some of them were because the camera had never really been refurbished. Someone had just simply 600 modded it, or someone had just simply reskinned it without doing anything to the insides. I had one where someone had clearly made a mistake and the flash fire assembly needed completely adjusting. And as I said, I'm not trying to throw shade at anyone here. I'm perfectly capable, and I have made some of these mistakes in the past. It's why I have a warranty, and it's why I'll repair something and make it a priority if something that I've built for you suddenly goes wrong. But the thing is, if you send me a camera that's already been refurbished, it's a Schrodinger's cat situation where I don't know what's been done to it inside unless I see it for my own two eyes. And if I'm going to the point where I'm opening it up and checking everything, well, it's not that much extra work to then repair it in the first place. Like, it's basically the same amount of work. And I'll give you an example of this from a camera that I just recently did from a client. They purchased it on eBay. This is from a Model 3, but the part I'm looking at here is the rubber tongue, right? And the tongue is cut in such a way that it leaves this kind of like trapezoidal shape. This is called an alpha spec rubber baffle. Now, one of the things that I have to do is check and make sure, for example, on an early model camera, that rubber is cut at an angle, because early ones had a square cut of rubber, and that square cut tends to get caught on the inside of the chassis, introducing a lag when the mirror flips up. So regardless of who refurbished the camera, that's something that I'll want to check, because it's easy to miss, it's easy to forget about, and it does make a serious difference should that tongue ever start to slip forwards. It can introduce a real lag into how the camera works. And that's just one thing that I need to check. But what I'm trying to get at here is for me to check that, well, I've got to have it open. And if it's already open, it's only going to take me all of 3 extra seconds to cut that extra bit of rubber in the first place. So it's basically the same amount of work for me to check something as it is to refurbish something. And that goes for the rest of the bits and pieces on the camera too. So the other thing that I wanted to speak about, and I'll clear my bench and get a piece of paper because I think some diagrams would really help, is I want to talk about why it is so important to fully overhaul everything, even if a camera works. Because the other thing that I get asked, beyond just, hey, I had my thing refurbished by, whoever it might be, whether they bought it off eBay or Mint or Retrospect or Brooklyn Film Camera or Dr. SX-70 or Chromatic Parts, whatever it may be, I want to talk about just how important it is to fully overhaul an SX-70. And what I mean by fully overhaul is stripping it down and preemptively checking every single major known point of failure. Because what I was saying before, there's no standardized method of repair. Some technicians will end up getting asked by a client who, may want to spend very little money, and they'll say, can you just get it working? So the technician might, unjam the shutter blades, hand it back to the client, and then that client in a few months' time lists it on Facebook Marketplace and goes, yeah, I had this fully overhauled by a technician. When it wasn't. Right? I had it repaired. And so someone may assume that someone's been through and checked and corrected everything, but that's not the case. So it starts to introduce problems, especially when cameras start to change hands several times, because there's no way to know what's going on inside the camera. And there's also no way for me to know that something hasn't been damaged by the user. So it ends up putting me in this situation where when I'm asked to just 600 mod it, just upgrade the PCB, just add the polar vault, it starts to compromise my integrity as a technician if I don't go and check everything else inside. Because at some stage, if that camera changes hands, I'm going to end up looking like a schmuck if my big refurbished by Instant Camera Guy sticker is attached to a faulty camera where the fault wasn't a fault of my own. But let's dive into now a little bit of why it is so important to have these cameras completely overhauled in the first place. Why is there such a need to strip these things back all the way to the chassis and rebuild them from the ground up? And well, I've got a few examples here in front of me which are going to help talk about this kind of thing. I've also got this one here which is unrefurbished. This is going to be great to talk about in a second. But let's get a piece of paper out and let's get a pencil. And let's just start to old school, do a little bit of a drawing, hey? So when I take on an SX-70, SX-70s are important to service for 3 main reasons. And I like to call it the triad of reasons that you need to service a camera. So the first reason at the top is age. So in other words, wear and tear. All right. Now, although these cameras look super futuristic, right? Although they look like something that landed from an alien spacecraft, we have to remember that these things are somewhere between 50 to 40 years old at the time of me posting this video. Now, by the time that you are 40 and 50 years old, you'll probably be starting to wear out too. So at the very least, I have to take into consideration things like storage, use, abuse. Was the camera left somewhere moist for the last 40 years, and that moisture has now caused rust and corrosion and oxidization of the mirror and dirty Fresnel and fungus growth? Was the camera abused? Did it get dropped back in the day? Did it get mishandled? Did it get broken physically by someone that didn't know how to use it? Or simply has the camera just been overused? Has it been so well loved that it's completely clapped out now, right? Through no fault of the owner, it's just been used to death. That's one of the first things that I need to consider and rectify when servicing a camera, and it's the one that most people will naturally be familiar with. If we come down to the second little point of our pyramid here, we have design flaws. Now, this is something that I've touched on in the past because particularly the original model SX-70, so generally the chrome and tan one, so the Model 1, it was released in 1972, and when they came to the market, it was basically by being forced by shareholders. Dr. Edwin Land and the Polaroid Corporation had spent the equivalent of $1 billion in today's money researching and developing the camera, and every single year that went by seemed to be an extra year that Polaroid was throwing money at this thing. They came up with custom-made factories, the size of city blocks. They used the Cray supercomputer to design the curved mirror in the viewfinder. They literally commissioned two of the biggest chip manufacturing companies and PCB manufacturing companies in the world to, in secret, design the brains for the camera. The technology that went into the SX-70 was, without any other way of putting it, absolutely, completely and utterly cutting edge. It wouldn't become mainstream for this kind of stuff to appear in cameras for another 10 or 20 years. So they were truly ahead of their time, and that came at the expense of cost. And what started to happen is the shareholders started to all see how much money Polaroid was blowing on this special experiment project, and pretty much forced Edwin Land's hand. The legend goes that he was pretty much threatened to be booted out of his own company if they didn't release a product, and so the original SX-70 was released to the market with a whole bunch of design flaws. Now, for those that have seen my SX-70 restoration videos or left them on in the background and heard me waffling on about the insides of the camera, you'll know a little bit about this and all the various flaws. And Polaroid would spend the greater part of a decade revising these flaws, and they would actually send out to the factory and to the repair techs all around the world things called bulletins. Now, bulletins documented little revisions, upgrades, changes that Polaroid was making to the cameras in order to make them better over the years. And the bulletins that we know about consist of about 300 pages of documents documenting small and unique changes because these things came out of the oven so half-baked. Polaroid was constantly revising things and didn't stop revising things until about the SX-70 sonar and the SLR-680 that would then follow. But those are basically the same camera inside. So early models from about 1972 to about 1977 often have little design flaws inside, whether it be a drive shaft coupler that's made of plastic, whether it be a PCB that's made by Fairchild, which was considered unreliable, whether it had that rubber baffle issue that I was talking about, whether it had things like the electric eye that was prone to corrosion. Lots of little things existed in the original SX-70 design that causes them to spontaneously brick themselves over time and need repairing. Even if they're in mint condition, you can pick up an SX-70 that has sat like a time capsule from the 50s and it still doesn't work properly. And that is just because they came out of the oven half-baked. Now that leads us to the other part of the foundation of our little pyramid here. Cost reduction. Now, cost reduction happened throughout the later models of SX-70 design as a byproduct of the design flaws. See, for every revision that they had to try and fix on the original design, Polaroid had to spend money figuring out. And when they were spending money, it meant that they had to save money elsewhere. And so what you ended up having was later model Polaroids, for every issue that they fixed, ended up with a new issue as a byproduct of cost reduction. So for example, on most early SX-70 Model 1s, the lens board that's on the side is held in place with something that I like to call little nipples. They're basically little lugs. I'll show you an example of it. I always keep them spare when I find them, but effectively the little legs on the lens board have little lugs that press into the shutter housing. And this makes the lens board very easy to replace. You bend the legs, You put it on, you bend them back, the little pins or little nipples, little, whatever you want to call them. I don't think they have any kind of official name. But basically, they're easy to replace. On later models, they decided that putting those on the lens board was too costly, and so they swapped to rivets. And that means that if you end up with a later model camera, such as the Model 2, the lens board is riveted in place. They also replaced a lot of the screws that held the body panels in. So for example, on a Model 1, the bellows assembly at the top is generally held in place with 4 screws. The shutter housing is held in place with screws. Like everything is screwed in place. On later model cameras, they went away with the screws and started using rivets to secure everything. So that means, for example, on an SX-70 sonar like this, that bellows all of a sudden becomes very difficult to replace. If you get a pinhole and you can't patch it and you need to replace the bellows, you need to physically drill out every single rivet on the back of the lens, on the back of the long panel here, just to get the bellows off. And it's the same thing with connecting the bellows there to the lens board. The lens board is riveted to the side. So there's a lot of issues that come about with repair because of cost reduction. Another obvious one is evident here, and that's the synthetic skin that Polaroid used. The synthetic skin tends to crumble away into dust over time. That dust gets in the shutter assembly, it gets in the viewfinder, it causes everything to look really grubby, and it needs to be reskinned. And another very common issue is the mirrors. So inside an SX-70 chassis, there's a mirror, and that mirror is held in place from the factory with 3 big blobs of silicon. And in later model cameras, typically starting at the SX-70 sonar series, but definitely continuing into the SLR-680 series, that mirror is always loose because the type of silicon they used or the type of coating that was on the mirror basically separates over time. The mirror comes loose, it drops inside the camera where it tends to smash and shatter, destroying everything. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that regardless of the year that your camera was from, odds are it has something that needs to be rectified if it's going to work at its best. For example, the SLR-680 electronically was the most reliable. However, I've seen time and time again 680s where the solder just wasn't done very well in the factory. They used very either cheap quality solder or very minimal amounts of solder. The joints go dry and the camera ceases to work properly because power is not getting to the autofocus motor or the shutter. There's so many things like this, and there's no perfect solution. One of the most frustrating questions for me is when a client asks me, oh, well, which model SX-70 is best? The answer to that is simply a refurbished one. It doesn't matter. They're all capable of producing the same image quality. The only thing that changed from generation to generation as far as the user is concerned is extra accessories, tripod socket and strap lugs, autofocus, and maybe a built-in flash if we're talking about the 680. Otherwise, it's the same lens on every single generation from 1972 through to the 690, SLR 690 released in Japan in the 1990s. It all uses the exact same lens. But the difference is basically in the types of issues that these cameras have. And as a result, and I'll drill this home again, it is so important to have a camera thoroughly serviced by a competent technician who's going to go through and check all the boxes and preemptively rectify every single factory known issue and every single design flaw that wasn't known by the factory that we now know now, in order to get the best results out of a product. Because there is simply, this has synthetic skin on it. Let's assume this thing worked, even though it doesn't. This belongs to a client of mine. There would be no point in me reskinning this whilst leaving that loose mirror inside there. It's just a ticking time bomb waiting for disaster. Now, there's one bonus thing that I will refer to here. And again, I'm trying not to throw shade here, but I'm going to write it down anyway. And that is what I like to call Cowboy repairs. Now, This exists on its own outside the triangle of issues that SX-70s have. And it's a byproduct of not malicious intent, but it's a byproduct of the sort of speculative investment that comes in SX-70 cameras. It is not uncommon for people to see these things and go, wow, I can buy these pretty cheap and reskin them and slap them online, say it's been refurbished, and double my money. And you'll see it all the time. eBay and Etsy is filled with cameras that meet that description with no real way of knowing exactly what's happened inside. I see it all the time. If you go on Reddit, you'll see it all the time. If you go on the SX-70 Facebook group, you'll see it all the time. As I said before, there's no real standard of figuring out what's happened inside your camera. You just need to sort of trust that someone's done a decent job. I know of people who have installed SX-70R PCBs and not calibrated the solenoid. I've had cameras come my way which have been, sold as fully refurbished. I had a client pay over $500 for an SX-70 Alpha, which wasn't refurbished at all. The person had 600 modify it. They'd never opened up the camera inside. The motor was completely clapped out. The thing barely worked at all. So this is a big issue, and I raise it because it's just so common. Part of what I'm trying to do with this channel is educate people on like the bare minimum that you have to do if you want to consider one of these things fully working. And like I'm at the stage where like I don't want to come across as some kind of jerk who's like judging everyone based on their repair abilities, because I do get that some people may want it for a lower cost, and they might be lured in by a technician's offering repairs as needed. They say, oh great, he can just replace the sonar transducer for me and then the rest of the camera will work. Well, yes, you can do that, but what you got to remember is if you don't preemptively rectify everything else that's inside the camera, you'll probably get issues down the line. And one of the things that I understand, but at the same time doesn't make a lot of sense to me, is when people try and have a race to the bottom in terms of prices. The reason being that film for these is really expensive. Like, compared to the camera itself, the cost that you will spend on film over a lifetime of using this thing dwarfs it completely. And I just don't understand people that insist on trying to shoot very expensive film, which is finicky at the best of times, on a product that just isn't working right. Or, they have to, really compensate with the light dark wheel or something because it overexposes, and they have to come up with all these kind of solutions. The cameras themselves are getting more expensive. It's worth investing the money to have one of these things fully serviced. And if you don't believe me, just ask anyone in the comments below. Like, for example, one person that springs to mind is a guy called Derek, and I refurbished his camera, and he posts a lot across the various Facebook groups and online forums. And the caliber of the shots that he gets out of his camera, like the colors look amazing, the sharpness is amazing. And that was a camera that I built for him. It's got the brand new SX-70R PCB. And every time I see a result, I'm like, holy moly, it's such good, like such great colors. And like, obviously he's a good photographer too. But the fact he's using a camera that works really, really well, like you can tell the difference. Not that gear is everything, of course. It's all about how you use it. But, the fact that he's got such a great working camera and you can shoot I-type in it and that kind of stuff and have manual control, I'm sure really helps him out a lot. So anyway, I just wanted to make that a point because I feel like this is a topic that just like no one knows about the complexities that exist inside one of these things. And I wanted to do a slightly shorter video explaining it. I know I've still managed to talk for about half an hour, but the thing is that these are just very, 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 very complex cameras and deserve respect and deserve to be refurbished properly. And like I said, that's why I released this channel, because I want people to understand this knowledge. When I started out doing repair, there was very little information on the internet. My repair as a result was totally cringe. Like if you compare what I was doing back in the day to what I was doing now, it's absolute amateur hour. And that's because back in the day, I repaired things as needed too. You know, I would happily fix a drive shaft coupler, charge someone $100 and be on my way. But I've come to realize as the years go by, that was just such a bad idea. Like it's not showing the camera the respect that it deserves. And in my opinion, if it's worth doing well. And so that's what I do these days. Now, does that mean that doing it the other ways is necessarily wrong? Of course not. But in my opinion, and this is simply just my opinion, anything less than a full overhaul of a camera is a waste of time. I'm sorry. Reskinning a camera without servicing the insides is a waste of time. And if you're going to add a battery adapter without soldering the rest of the ribbon cables, doing the motor and you know, doing everything else on the camera that's going to make it run properly for the, you know, as long as it possibly can, is a waste of time. Doing things half-assed, you know, I-type converting a camera but leaving the shutter converted to SX-70 film and just saying like, oh, I'll just use filters, is a waste of time. Like, you don't get the benefit of shooting something that's fully refurbished. There is a difference. But anyway, I think I've said enough. I think I've driven home the point, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video and get a bit out of it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because I'm eager to hear what all of you think. And yeah, we'll keep the discussion going there. Until then, you guys have been a wonderful audience. As always, if you like what I do, you can feel free to leave a donation through my Ko-fi account, or simply just give me a like, a subscribe, or share some of my content. And I will see you guys in the next video.